Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, you can tap or mouse over the video playback area of your screen to reveal the chapter titles and starting points of each section. In this week's podcast, I have Tidbits. I have an update on my vintage 1960s sweater project. I have some answers to some questions that you've asked in the past week, and I have a question for you guys. And I also have an update on my sewing adventures. So let's get started. This first tidbit came to me from Edgehill on Ravelry, and it's a link to a YouTube video on the physics of knitting. And it's a presentation given by Sabetta Motsumoto at Georgia Tech University in Atlanta, Georgia. And I have shared previously articles about her work on the physics of knitting in previous tidbits over the past, I don't know, sometime in the past year. And recently somebody sent me an article that had appeared in Popular Mechanics that was about this as well. Only there is a paywall that I couldn't get through. I was able to at least see what it was about and who it was about and realize that, oh, this is the same person. So this is a video that all of you could watch, and it's a lot more in-depth than a small little article that you might have read previously. So I'll leave a link down to that YouTube video down in the show notes. This next tidbit came to me, I believe it was in my Instagram feed, and it's an article, which I will link to below, about the world's oldest thread that was discovered. And it was discovered in a site that was a Neanderthal site. So this was not only a remarkable discovery for how old it is, because it's 52,000 years old. The next oldest piece of thread that scientists have found or archaeologists have found is 19,000 years old, because these threads, fabric, those kinds of things decompose and there's nothing remaining. So you can only speculate when the idea of spinning fibers into thread or cord might have been created. So this is evidence of not only that it was at least 52,000 years ago, but it was Neanderthals that were doing that. So that tells us that the Neanderthals had math skills and complex thinking, particularly since the fibers that they would have used were bast fibers. They were harvested from underneath the bark of a specific type of tree, which could only be done at certain times of year. So that they had to know all of these things. Then they had to know that they could twist these fibers together in one direction to create a single thread. And then if they combined 3 of them together, they'd have to twist them in the opposite direction in order to create the thread. So, that's some complex thinking going on. The thread, they're describing it as being roughly equivalent to lace weight yarn that we would use today, but it was a 3-ply, so there are 3 plies in the thread. But I'll leave that article, link to the article, down in the show notes. So I want to give you an update on my vintage 1960s sweater. I have finished the left front, so each of the 2 fronts is complete, and what I have left is really, I have a small amount of the back that I never finished because I was unsure about my gauge and sizing at one point, and so I needed to wash and block it. And I decided, when I returned to it and continued on to knit the front. So I do still have to complete just a little bit of the back, but the 2 fronts are completed. So what's left are the 2 sleeves and the 2 front yokes and the button band and buttonhole band. So the order of construction of sweaters from this era, and certainly up until, even now, there, especially in the UK, this is very common. If it's bottom-up construction, knit flat in pieces, the order of construction is the back, then the right front, then the left front, and then the button bands. That's just very standard way of doing things. It wasn't always that way. In the All Things Vintage group, there was a discussion last year about sort of the order in which the garment parts were constructed. And in the vintage UK patterns, it was very common to start with the front and then do the back. And so I looked through like these 1940s books that are all from the UK. And it was interesting, even though they were written by these two women, which I assume they were really compiling and editing those books. They may have designed some of them, but I just can't imagine that those two women could have designed all of those garments because they published every single year. They must have had people working with them on the designs as well, I assume. But what you can see in those patterns is that many of them started with the back and many of them started with the front, so that there wasn't a consistency, at least in these UK patterns in the 1940s. Earlier than that, there was a lot of variation in construction in terms of the direction of construction. Some of the stuff that I knit that was from the very early part of the 20th century started at the bottom back, came up to the shoulders, and then went straight down the fronts. And then the sleeves were knit from the top down. So there were often multiple directions that things were knit. And the stitch patterns were chosen based on the fact that they looked the same right side up and upside down. So as things got into the middle of the century, first of all, you started getting multiple sizes rather than just one size. So they would present you with 3 sizes, and in the case of my pattern, there are actually 5 sizes for this particular pattern. Sometimes there were 4 because this was a kit that came with a finite amount of yarn. So I think one of the patterns that I got from one of these kits had 5 sizes and all of them you could make 3/4 length sleeves, and then only the 4 smallest if you wanted to do full length sleeves. So it would depend on the amount of yarn, where if you were buying a pattern and buying the yarn separately, they would have just told you to use more yarn. So the order of construction for this particular sweater follows that standard where you start with the back, then you do the right front, and then you do the left front. And then it wants you to do the sleeves, which I'm keeping for last because of my concern about the amount of yarn that I have and whether I will have enough to do full-length sleeves. It's pretty touch and go. And then after the sleeves, the instructions say to work the left button band and yoke, and then end with the right buttonhole band and yoke. And I was kind of surprised by that. I was like, why would they have you do the right front, the left front, and then the left yoke and the right yoke? And it's because button band versus buttonhole band. And so I'm going to do an overhead just to show you where this is right at the moment. And then I'm going to show you a little bit about of my spreadsheet, because people ask about my spreadsheets a lot, and I did give you guys links to some of the videos where I've done segments on how I set my spreadsheets up. But I recorded a little segment that showed where I am in my spreadsheet and what things look like at this point as well. So these are my 2 fronts that I have knit so far. This is the right front, and when we talk about the right front and the left front, we're talking about the right front as worn on the body, not as the viewer looks at it. So this is the right front and this is the left front. So the right front is going to have the buttonhole band, and I have done 1 buttonhole so far. So I cast on with the smaller needles, which was a US 0 or 2 millimeter needle. And then I switched to the US 2, which is a 2.75 millimeter needle, in order to do the stockinette portion. So this band also needs to be worked on that smaller needle. That's why you put them on hold, is because the band needs to continue to be worked at a firmer gauge in order to not be floppy and drapey the way that the sweater fabric is. You want it to be firmer, a firmer fabric, plus you have the ribbing to help keep that structure. The stockinette portion that I knit was 114 rows. The way that the button bands work on these kinds of patterns is that you knit it so that when it's slightly stretched, that it matches the length. And in this case, when it's slightly stretched, it has to go just a little bit beyond here, because now it's going to, I'm going to start increasing. And I think they want to be able to keep that corner nice and not have it get pulled and distorted too much. So I think this is the correct length I need for this. So I have 130 rows. These markers, that's 50 rows. This is where I started. I marked the stitch below the needle when I came back to do the button band. So that was row 0. This is 50, 75, 100, and then I marked every 10 rows after that, because I want to keep track of that. And when I seam it together, I want to seam it at a ratio where I'm taking, I think this is going to work, the 130 stitches, maybe 125 actually to be seamed against there. I'm not sure exactly. But basically, I need to seam 10 rows here to every 11 rows here. And so I will clip these together as I seam. And then once I have it done, I will make sure that I like the way that the edge is still, even, and it's not getting pulled up or distorted, and everything looks fine. And once I know that that is the number of rows that I have is really what I want, and I don't want something different, then I will start filling in with the yoke. And what this will tell me, by knowing how many rows I have, then I can go get buttons and I can figure out how to space them. I'm going to need to put the first button across from where the buttonhole is, and then I'm going to have to put another button, very near the top. And then I'll have to space the other ones out evenly. So I'll figure out exactly how I'm spacing them, and I'll look at how many rows apart they are, make sure that everything is totally even, so that when I go back and work the buttonhole band, I will know exactly when to make a buttonhole in which row number all the way across, so that these buttons will be evenly matched all the way across. So when I was working on this left front, I had to do 15 decreases. So every right side row I did a decrease until I eliminated 15 stitches. So I think it was when I was at row 9 or decrease 9 that I recorded a little bit about my spreadsheet and showed you what that looked like and where I was at that particular point. And then after I recorded that, I went ahead and completed this, and then I knit the button band. So that is what I will show you next, is what my spreadsheet looked like at that particular point. Here's the left front. So this is telling me how many stitches to cast on, how much ribbing that is. This is the number of rows that I'm working. So this many stitches for this many rows adds up to that many stitches. This is my running total. So these kinds of notes, I use these notes to keep track of how far along I am. This is the percentage complete I am over here, where you see the 42.7. I keep little notes like, this is where I put the button band stitches on hold and I'm changing to large needles and stockinette stitch. This is where I'm doing my first, and I'm doing this for 6 rows, and then I do my first increase at the side. I do that on only 1 row, and then I'm working 9 rows plain right here. So this is keeping track of my stitch count. So when I do my next increase, then this stitch count is going to be, if I click on that cell, you can see what the equation is up here at the top. It's what's in the cell above it plus 1 stitch. So that's telling me that's what my stitch count currently is. This right here, if you look at the top up here, this is saying that the number of stitches that I should have for this row, these rows right here, is the same as whatever is in the row above it. So this all gets calculated for me. I'm putting those formulas in. So this is the body part, and now when I come down to here, this is where I begin the shaping for the neck and also for the underarm. And I made this little note here that this is going to be a right side row, so that I can keep track of, it just helps me keep track and orient myself. So when I have decrease 1, this is the armhole decreases that I'm referring to, because I only do those 15 times and then I'm done. And that's why I highlighted that here, just to get a visual reminder for me in my spreadsheet. You need to stop doing your armhole decreases, because that's like every right side row I'm doing an armhole decrease, and I need to remind myself to stop doing that. The neck decreases are harder to keep track of because it changes whether I'm doing them on a right side or a wrong side row. Where I just finished is right here. I just finished my 9th armhole decrease, and I also had a neck decrease. I should have 44 stitches on the needle at this point after I finish this row, so I just counted them, and that is accurate. I have done all the decreases at when I'm supposed to do them. What you see over here is the running total of the stitches that I've done, of all of the stitches I've knit so far. It's over 50,000. Which is, for if a worsted weight sweater, I'd be almost done with the sweater at this point. But this is fingering weight, so twice as many stitches. So I'm only halfway done. What knitting podcasts do I watch? So I really don't watch any knitting podcasts. I have been subscribing to a number of sewing channels, and I would actually call these channels. Like I consider Casual Friday to be a podcast. I don't consider my Technique Tuesdays to be a podcast. So I have a YouTube channel where I have various types of videos. Sometimes I do these live stream videos as well. So I do subscribe to several sewing channels. There is one channel I subscribe to called Engineering Knits, where she knits a lot of historical patterns, but she also is sewing vintage patterns as well. So sometimes she'll make an outfit that includes sewing and knitting as well. So I do watch her channel as far as knitting, but mostly it's like sewing channels, because when I'm sitting down in front of my computer to watch a video and I've got my knitting, I'm wanting to watch something where I'm going to learn something or be entertained by it, or something like that. So I am more likely to watch something that I know a lot less about than what I know about knitting. And I do watch knitting videos when I need them, if I'm exploring a new technique, or I want to see what are the different ways people are using this, or how many different ways are there to do something. I will sometimes go and look specifically for particular videos that are on particular techniques, but I don't really subscribe to any other knitting channels. The next question is, I would love to see you do a video about converting a step bind off shoulder to a short row shoulder and then the 3 needle bind off. So I've actually done this. I've actually done 2 videos on this. What they're talking about is when you are knitting a sweater, it could be you're knitting in the round up to the underarms, and then you separate for the front and the back, and then you get up to the shoulders and you need to bind off the shoulders. So for this type of sweater, you typically have sloped shoulders. So the back of the neck is higher and the shoulders follow your natural shoulder line, which is angled. And so one way of doing that is to bind off about 1/3 of the stitches and then knit back or purl back to the end of the row, and then bind off the next 1/3 of the stitches, etc., so that you are creating an edge that has a stair step bind off. Well, then you have to seam that together, and it can be done, but it doesn't look great on the inside, and sometimes it looks a little bit bumpy from the outside. So what you can do instead of doing these stair step bind offs is you can do short row shaping, so that you end up with all of the stitches still on the needle and you have that angle at the same time. And that allows you to join the shoulders together, the front shoulder to the back shoulder, when you have all of those live stitches. And you can use a technique called the 3 needle bind off, where the stitches from the front needle and the stitches from the back needle are each on their own needles and they're held parallel, and you use a 3rd needle to knit the stitches together to join them while you're binding off. So you're binding and joining at the same time. And so I have done a video where it's as if you're doing the front of the sweater where the two shoulders are separate because you have shoulder shape, you have neck shaping that has caused you to have to separate the two sides from each other. So that how you do one of those at a time. And then there's another video where you're doing the back, and often you don't have neck shaping at the back to scoop it. So you have all of the back stitches at the same time, and you have to do that shaping at the same time. So I have 2 videos on that, which I will link down below. So this next question came from, and I had her name in here and now it's not in my notes. I think her name is either Christy Pines or Christina Pines. I'll put it on the screen if I can find her name. But what she said was, I'm a longtime knitter, 60 years, and I remember when we used slip one, knit one, pass slip stitch over instead of SSK. So both of those are what we call left-leaning decreases. They produce the exact same result, but they're 2 different techniques. So she says, to my mind, the old-fashioned way seems so much easier, especially when using fine yarn on small needles. Why did this change? It seems to me it might have been editors who preferred the SSK as it's easier to write or type. So I knew part of the answer to this question. I knew that Barbara Walker invented the SSK. I wasn't completely sure about when she invented it. So I looked at 2 of the books that I have of hers. So Barbara Walker is responsible for these treasuries. This is the first treasury. It's just called A Treasury of Knitting Patterns, and it's a stitch dictionary. And then there is the second treasury. And then she went on to do other ones. She did another one called Charted Knitting Patterns, where she basically invented the way we chart patterns today, only she was doing it with pencil and gridded paper because this was the 70s. So A Treasury of Knitting Patterns came out in 1968, and the second treasury came out in 1970. And in both of these books, she has a list of knitting terms and abbreviations in the beginning of the book. And in both of these books, she describes the SSK. And she explains that how to do it. You slip one as if to knit, slip another as if to knit, and then you insert your left needle through the fronts of those stitches and then work them together. Her reasoning was, as Christy or Christina suggested, which was that it was a shorter abbreviation. SSK was a shorter abbreviation. It was also a different technique that would get you to the same endpoint. But she also said, anytime you see SSK, if you would prefer using slip one, knit one, pass slip stitch over, you can certainly do that. What I didn't know, though, was when other publications would have started using those terms. I looked in a couple of publications that I had that were maybe some of the oldest magazines that I bought when I was a new knitter. The oldest magazine I have is this copy of Knitters magazine. So this is a magazine published here in the US. I believe I think they're in South Dakota, which is just to the west of Minnesota. In the front, they list both SSK and SKP, which is a 3-letter abbreviation for slip one, knit one, pass slip stitch over. So Knitters in 1990 certainly had both of those abbreviations in the book. The next thing I did was, this is my old copy of a Vogue Ultimate Knitting book. Now mine is a second edition, and this one was published in 2002. The first edition was published in the late 80s, and I don't have a copy of that. But I do know somebody who wrote or edited the chapter on decreases for the first edition and who also worked for Knitters magazine. But I wasn't really completely sure if the first edition of Vogue included that, and I didn't know. So it's Joni Coniglio. She is my technical editor at Interweave because I write technical knitting articles for different Interweave magazines. So I emailed her and asked her if she had any idea when SSK kind of entered into publications, at least here in the United States. I don't think Barbara Walker was necessarily well known in the UK. I don't know that her books reached the UK. But what Joni said to me was, first of all, Joni was editor at Knitters starting in about 1997. And what she said was that when she got to Knitters, she just picked one. She thought it was just more convenient to either use SSK or SKP in all the patterns. And she just chose SSK. She also told me that when she was editing that first edition of Vogue's Ultimate Knitting book, is that she relied heavily on Montse Stanley's book, that she hadn't known that Barbara Walker had anything to do with the SSK, that she had seen it in Montse Stanley's book and relied heavily on that. So the book that Joni's talking about is this one that I talk about all the time. That's my favorite reference book. I don't know that I knew the SSK was in there because, this is not something I look up these days. So I really didn't even know where I might find it. So sure enough, I found it in here. Now, this book was originally published in 1986 in the UK as the Hand Knitters book. And she does mention SSK. I don't see anywhere in here where she references Barbara Walker, but obviously Barbara Walker has it in her books from 1968 and 70, and Montse Stanley is referencing it here, and then Joni referenced this in Vogue Ultimate Knitting, and so on and so on. So at least in the US, it was coming into being known more by like 1990 and on, certainly. And Montse Stanley was in the UK, and she was talking about SSK, but I don't know at what point the UK patterns picked up on that. So sometimes publications have their standard way of doing something and they just stick with it. So even today, a lot of UK patterns will use slip one, knit one, pass slip stitch over. I thought it was a really interesting question, and I was really happy to have learned something from the process of trying to get a more detailed answer than, well, I know Barbara Walker invented it, I just don't know what happened after that. So the person who asked that previous question also had a second question, which was, do you know of a way to replace knit 3 together and get the same result? Again, on small needles with thin yarn, not so easy. And that is also something that I have done a video for. I'll just explain it briefly here, and if you can't quite visualize what's going on, I'll leave a link down in the show notes. Basically, whatever kind of decrease you want that's knit 2 together, that's bigger than a knit 2 together, like knit 3 together, knit 4 together, knit 5 together, however many you have to knit together, you can start with a knit 2 together. You do the knit 2 together and you return that stitch to your left hand needle. And then you can just start passing stitches that are to the left of that knit 2 together, pass them over and off the needle. So if you need a knit 3 together, you've got the knit 2 together is the first stitch on the needle, and the stitch next to it, you just pass it over that knit 2 together, and now you've got a knit 3 together. And now, of course, you need to return that back to the right hand needle. But if you have to do like a knit 7 together, do a knit 2 together, return it to the left hand needle, and just keep passing stitches over until you have gotten up to the number that you needed to decrease out, and then return the result to the right hand needle. So the next question has to do with what is on the shelf above me, which you can see when I'm doing a Technique Tuesday video and I'm standing. You can see these jars behind me. So I'll go get one. So this is what the jars look like. There's another one that has other yarn in it. I used to have just little balls, leftover balls of worsted weight yarn that I had kept in here. So when I was reorganizing a few weeks ago, and I had a shelf of yarn that I wanted to do some destashing and reorganization. One of the things that I'm really conscious of right now is that I need to be able to see what I have, or I will forget about it. And so one of the challenges with this kind of yarn, these are little 25-gram balls of Shetland wool. So they're very tiny. I have like one of each color. There's a couple of them that maybe I have two of them. But they were in kind of a deep cube and just hard to see what was in there. And so what I did was I got rid of all of those little leftover balls of worsted weight that were just decoration, and I put them in this jar. And that way I can actually see what colors I have just by looking at the jar. Which brand? This is Jamieson and Smith. This one right here is Jamieson's, which is a different company than Jamieson and Smith. So it's two different brands of Shetland wool yarn. They're the same yarn weight. They could be used together, but they're just different brands. So I separated them out into their own jars. So one of the reasons I think that people ask me, could you do a video on such and such, and not realize that I've already done a video on that, is because it's kind of an overwhelming number of videos on my channel. So I do two different types of videos. I do these Casual Friday podcasts, but I do the Technique Tuesday videos. And at this point, I have about 160 some Casual Friday videos. And then my technique videos, I have, I don't know, 250 or 60 of those videos. And each of those is in at least one playlist. Often they're in multiple playlists if it's something that applies to multiple topics. But there are a lot of playlists, and trying to figure out where to look for those, how to even navigate the playlists can be a difficult prospect. I am looking for a way to reorganize my playlists in some way. I downloaded all of the titles of all of my videos today, and there's 410 of them or something like that. And again, a lot of them are Casual Fridays, but even within the Casual Fridays, trying to figure out how people can find things that might be of interest to them. I don't know if there's a way to do that or not. And with the Technique Tuesday videos, there might just be a way to organize them differently in playlists. On my channel homepage, I have the ability to highlight certain types of videos or certain playlists, but not all of the playlists. Like, the only way you can see all of the playlists is from my channel homepage. There is like a little bar of choices, like videos, playlists, community, this, and there's various different topics. So you can click on the thing that says playlists and then see the list of all of the different playlists and then go through them. Or you can search my channel for particular topics as well. You can only search my channel if you are using the YouTube website, using something like Chrome or Safari. So if you go to the YouTube website using a browser, then you will see two search boxes on my homepage. One of them is for searching YouTube, and the other is for searching my channel. If you are using the YouTube app on a phone or a tablet, you will see one search box. And that search box is searching YouTube. It's not searching my channel. You may get results for my channel, but it's not searching my channel. If you use the search box that actually searches my channel, it will search the text of all of the transcripts of my actual videos, everything that I've actually said. So even if it's not in the title and it's not in the description, but I've actually said it, it can find that. If you are searching my channel from my channel homepage using a browser to access the YouTube website, but you can't do it that way if you are on a mobile device. So anyway, if you have any suggestions for playlist organization or information about struggles that you've had trying to find particular types of videos on my channel, I would welcome any feedback or suggestions. So last week in my sewing adventures, I had made a t-shirt. I needed to seam the sleeve hem, and I never did. I just realized this morning, I never finished that t-shirt. In the meantime, I had some issues with the neck. It was a little little flared in, particularly in one location. And a number of you commented and said, well, the neckband needs to be shorter by a couple of inches. It needs to be shorter than the neck opening. And it was. I was aware of that, and the pattern certainly called for that. The pattern also said, don't stretch, stretch the neck band to fit as you're sewing, but don't stretch the rest of the fabric. So I think what happened was, as I went around, it was a deep scoop neck, so it's fairly straight, and then it would scoop at the bottom. I didn't have any trouble keeping my edges matching as I went the straight part. And as I came around the corner and the edges were kind of pulling apart and I was trying to get them together, I think what I probably did was I probably stretched the actual t-shirt fabric, which then would cause the little rippling. I think that's probably what it was, because the neck certainly was short enough for what is typically recommended. I did not use ribbing, which is very stretchy. It was self fabric, so I had to use less, but not as much less as you would if it was ribbing. So I think the combination of it was a deep neck, and the neckband was really on the edge of being as wide as it could be for a neck that deep. I would actually prefer something narrower, so if I make this t-shirt again, I will make a narrower neckband. And I'll also be more careful about making sure I'm not stretching the t-shirt fabric itself. So I appreciate all the comments and the help with troubleshooting. So I think I am pretty convinced that the issue was user operator error and not designer error in terms of how long that neckband was. So the next thing I am working on is drafting a skirt pattern. So I've done one skirt sloper, it's called, where you design a straight skirt using your measurements. And I used a class off of Craftsy that was by Susie Furrer. And one of the things that I noticed on the Craftsy classes when I was like a month or two ago, when I was first looking at all these different sewing classes on skirts in particular, is that every instructor has an audience that they are imagining is watching their videos. So Susie Furrer, it teaches design students, and she frequently is talking about, well, the industry standard is to measure a location this many inches below the natural waist, and that's where you take the measurement for the high hip, for example. So she constantly is talking about these industry standards in terms of things like measuring. She's always talking about measuring somebody else, and she's talking about landmarks on the body based on industry standards. So there were some things that were a little frustrating about that for me, because my body is not industry standard. I was figuring that out. It's a little different in certain places, and that's what I really am looking for in terms of making something for myself, is that it's going to fit me. I don't care if it fits somebody else. I had come across a YouTube channel called In-House Patterns Studio, and the woman who does it her name's Alexandra Morgan, and she's also a trained designer and teaches students as well. But her focus is on teaching individual sewers how to fit to their own body, how to either draft a pattern that was going to fit their body shape, or how to use a commercial pattern. Once you've figured out what your body shape is and how to mold it, then how you can use those concepts in order to modify a commercial pattern. So she's really focused on the individual knitter, or not, I keep saying knitter, sewer. Her video on measurements, first of all, she's showing you how to measure yourself. So she's not saying, well, here, you need to get a friend to do this and do this and this. She showed you how to do it yourself. And I'd seen this trick of using a piece of elastic and tying it around, one point of the body, and using that as a central point, like the waist, in terms of measuring down from there, or measuring this point or that point. She had 3 pieces of elastic, one around her bust, one around her waist, one around her hips. And she explained the landmarks of things like the high hip in terms of your body, like measure that, but in between your waist and your full hip, and not in terms of where is the industry standard or where is this typically. Because one of the things that really threw me when I was trying to figure out exactly where to measure myself is that they would say, they would explain, they take pains to explain where your natural waist is, which I have no problem finding because I actually still have a waist. But then they would give a landmark like the belly button. It's immediately above your belly button. And I'm like, no, it's not. And then they would say, and then your high hip is a couple inches below your belly button. And like, what? You know, so I couldn't figure it out. And it turns out my belly button is 2 or 3 inches lower than my natural waist. I never knew I had a low belly button, but I do. So Alexandra Morgan doesn't mention the belly button at all. She is saying, here's how you find your waist, here's how you find your hip, here's how you find your high hip, here's where it is relative to your own body. Here's how you take this tricky measurement or that tricky measurement. And then if you can't get somebody to take this back measurement, this is just not possible to do on yourself, you can extrapolate it using this particular formula. So I found that very helpful. In this May, she has this free class on drafting a skirt pattern. And it's a 5-day class where she sends you an email with a PDF with all of the initial information. And then in the subsequent days, she tells you what to do, you know, do your measurements. And then the next day, do the calculations. And then the next day, now you're still going to draft the pattern. And now you're going to do this. So I used her techniques to draft a new skirt sloper, and I will be doing sewing that up this week. In the meantime, I really wanted to find some wool fabric to practice on. And people are always in the Twin Cities recommending this place called SR Fabrics or SR Harris Fabric. It's like an outlet. So they have a lot of I think they have a lot of new fabrics as well, but they tend to be discounted, and there's a lot of do-it-yourself there, like you measure the fabric and cut it yourself unless you need more than 5 yards, or if you need silk, you have to have an employee cut that for you. It's very overwhelming. I'd only been there once 15 years ago, and we went there on a Saturday, and it was just like a zoo. It was huge, and just a huge amount of stuff and a huge number of people there, and it was just, and I don't know enough about fabrics to know this is what I'm looking for, and I can recognize it when I see it. You know, I'm not that way with sewing. I decided I was going to try it again, but I was going to go on a Monday morning right when they opened, and it was so much calmer. And then I could tell even that, oh, there are employees who work there, and I can ask a question and they're so friendly. And so I found this area where there's wool remnants, and I've got this fabric right here. It's heavier than my skirt fabric. I know that, but it will at least give me some practice with wool, and also just seeing the difference between different wool fabrics. Like the wool suiting, this, I think they were labeling wool coating. It's a heavy but not extra heavy fabric. And I started learning about how fabric weights are defined, like how much fabric weighs per square yard, and which I found very interesting. And to compare that with in hand knitting, how we refer to yarn weight in terms of, you know, how big the diameter, what gauge you'll get when you knit with it. But also being aware that in machine knitting, when you get these big cones of yarn, they frequently use a number designation that I believe refers to the number of yards per pound. So I think they do use that kind of a system in yarn for commercial or machine knitting. In hand knitting, we use the yarn weight in a different sense, and I think part of that might have to do with the variety of yarns that we use and the constructions that we might use in hand knitting versus what might be used in commercial knitwear, maybe. So I think that this fabric could be called a wool flannel, that it's been fulled, so it's a little thicker and heavier. It would be beautiful for kind of a light like a wool coat or something like that. But I got a couple of yards of it, 2 yards and an eighth for $12. So I don't mind practicing on this at all and trying different things out with it and to see, and maybe I can actually make something that I will want to use with this fabric in addition to practicing with it. So I'm learning a lot about fabrics. I'm drafting my second skirt sloper, and I will be sewing a muslin and possibly a wool skirt out of this fabric this weekend, and also experimenting with ease when you use different fabric weights. It's just going to be interesting to see how fabric and yarn, hand knitted fabric and woven fabrics, how those are similar and yet different. So that's just where I am with my sewing this week. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.